Alright, we have determined the reason why my face looks so shiny. Guys, it's the camera. It's just the camera, okay? That's just how it's gonna be. DNA. We all have it, but what is it and what does it have to do with the existence of God? I'm pretty sure a lot of you guys probably already know what DNA is. So mainly the question we're diving into is, what does DNA have to do with the existence of God? But just for a definition, the National Human Genome Research Institute defines DNA as containing the instructions needed for an organism to develop, survive, and reproduce. In other words, DNA is information. It is complex, coherent, and sensible information responsible for all of life. The structure of the DNA molecule was one of the major discoveries in 20th century biology. The names James Watson and Francis Crick probably ring a bell from whenever you took biology class. These two men discovered that DNA had a double helix structure and is made up of 4 bases. A, C, G, and T are the abbreviations. 4 years after they discovered the structure of the DNA molecule, Francis Crick, who was actually a code breaker in World War II, realized that these chemical bases functioned just like letters or digital characters in a written language or computer code. He noticed that it wasn't the structure or the shape of these bases that mattered most, but rather their arrangement in the genetic code. The way these bases are arranged in the helix determines how an organism will function. The question that we're going to tackle today is, where does DNA come from? And what does this mean, if anything, in terms of the existence of a creator? To start us off, I'd like to tell you a little bit about something called the Cambrian explosion, otherwise known as Cambrian radiation. For those of you familiar with the Cambrian explosion and know that it is related to the topic of evolution, which you're right, it is, I will not be making the case either for or against evolution in this video, just to clarify, but I will be mentioning things like mutation and random changes, but the aim today is not to take a stand on Darwinian evolution. But alright, the Cambrian explosion. The Cambrian layer is a layer in the fossil record in which we see the basic blueprints for all major animal forms. We see the basic blueprints for most living creatures in the animal kingdom. So we see animals with spinal cords, with compound eyes, with limbs, and things of that sort. What makes the Cambrian explosion significant is that it's basically the sudden emergence of a bunch of new types of animals. These animals came into existence rather rapidly, and we see all major life forms present at the same time in this layer. This is why a lot of people who reject Darwinian evolution will bring up the Cambrian explosion as a challenge. According to evolution, species mutate and then evolve gradually over time. But in the Cambrian layer, we see a bunch of different species all at the same time. Again, not diving into evolution today, just for context, this is why the Cambrian layer and the Cambrian explosion relates to the topic of evolution, but that's a topic for a different time. So we see all major life forms present at the same time in this layer of the fossil record. And the Cambrian explosion was so short that it's below the duration of the fossil record. So all we know is that these creatures came into existence over a very, very short amount of time. As an article by PubMed Central lays out, the massive burst of diversification we see in the Cambrian itself is a real event. I really like the way this article puts it. It says that the Cambrian explosion is a massive burst of diversification. I bring up the Cambrian explosion because it is closely related to DNA, which is the topic at hand for today. This explosion of new life forms inevitably required a huge infusion of new biological information, and that is precisely what DNA is. New life forms require new biological information. If you don't have information, you cannot build anything in life. And information doesn't come from nowhere, it comes from somewhere. So the question is where? Well, I'm going to talk for a bit, tell you where I think DNA comes from and why, and then of course I'll let you decide for yourself what to do with this information, but let's dive in. In biological systems like you and me and plants and all living creatures, information and instructions run the show. Along the spine of the DNA molecule are sequences of chemical bases that contain precise instructions for building proteins. Okay, so what are proteins? Proteins process information and form biological structures. They do most of the work in your cells, and they are essential for the survival of every living creature. An article by Nature explains that genes in DNA encode protein molecules, which are the workhorses of the cell, carrying out the functions necessary for all of life. DNA carries the information for all of the proteins an organism will ever have. The order of DNA is communicative. It communicates how to build a protein. DNA is not random. It communicates very precise, organized messages that are vital to the survival of an organism. So how do we get a brand new organism, like we see in the Cambrian explosion? Let's think of this in terms of computers. Those of you familiar with code know that if you want to give your computer a new function, you have to first give it new code. You have to give it new information. But you can't just give your computer any kind of code. The code you give it can't be random. I was actually talking to my friend Johan about this because he's currently getting his bachelor's in computer science. He knows a ton more about computers than I do. That's not really like my specialty or my workhouse, but I went ahead and I asked him what would happen if you were to go in and insert random changes to your computer code or change the computer code randomly. And he told me, these were his words, if it's completely random, your code will just break down and not work at all and will throw a lot of syntax errors and logical error values will be undefined and just dump. Random changes generally degrade meaning and create gibberish. If my friend Johan were to go into his computer and make random changes in the code, he would mess up the system because random changes are very likely to produce non-functional systems. And this relates to DNA, and we're going to get into why. DNA is a language system. When its characters are arranged in a particular functional order, not randomly, but functionally, you can get the information that is there, and it will produce a working product. DNA is like a master codebook. There is virtually an unlimited amount of messages that can be conveyed through different combinations of this code, or in this case, bases in language system. As long as you know this language of DNA, you can create multiple different messages. This is how millions of different species function. Although they look and operate differently, they all function. These millions of species all contain the same life-giving molecule, just with different messages within them that make them different from their counterparts. For example, there's only one of you out there. While your DNA generally relates to things like proteins and your cells, it is also involved in your phenotype or how you look physically. But moreover, your DNA is what makes you unique. But I have the same bases in my DNA as you do. Our DNA is all made up of relatively the same general parts, but they're organized in different ways that make you and I unique. So it matters how this genetic information is arranged. It can't just be completely random, or else it would produce meaningless gibberish. Again, if you make random changes, you will degrade information that is already there, not improve it. MIT professor Murray Eden says that no currently existing formal language can tolerate random changes in the symbol sequences which express its sentences. Meaning is almost invariably destroyed. So there are two main theories as to how new genetic information arises. Now, notice that I'm not talking about genetic information that makes one bird have a pointed beak and another bird have a round beak, or one dog have white fur and another dog have brown fur. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about new genetic information that gives rise to brand new organisms. An animal that came into existence all of a sudden, such as in the Cambrian explosion. So there are two main theories. Either a random mutational search for this information occurred in the genome, or this DNA was intentionally altered or designed to give rise to a new organism. Let's first talk about random mutation. The problem is there are vastly more ways to arrange characters in a way that would produce a non-functional organism than there are ways to arrange it that would give rise to a functioning organism. There are more ways to produce gibberish with random changes than there are to produce meaning. Think of this like a thief who wants to steal a bike that is connected to a bike lock. Imagine there are 4 dials on this bike lock, each numbered 0 through 9. But only one of the combinations will set this bike free. And as you know, the reason bike locks work is because there are more ways that a thief could enter the wrong combination than they would enter the right combination and set it free. It's more likely that a random search for the right code will fail and the thief will not be able to unlock your bike. So in a lock with 4 dials numbered 0 through 9, there are 10,000 possible combinations. Now, the thief could get this right, they could get it really lucky, and if given enough time, they actually could set your bike free. But what if the lock has 10 dials? Now there are 10 billion combinations that the thief would have to consider, and even if he devotes his whole life to the task, it is very unlikely he will ever set your bike free. Your bike's gonna be safe. How does this relate to DNA? A random mutation giving rise to a functional new gene or protein is much like the search for the right combination on the 10 dial lock, with 10 billion different combinations. And you'll see why in a second, because we can actually quantify this. Let's talk about a man named Douglas Axe. Axe is a molecular biologist. I'm going to link one of his papers down below for you guys to check out. And he actually discovered the probability of getting a functional protein based on random mutation. So random mutation occurred. What is the probability that this random mutation is going to result in a functioning new protein? So he did the math, and he found that for every protein that is 150 amino acids long, there are 10 to the 77th power, 10 to the 77th, amino acid arrangements that will not give rise to a functional, stable 3D protein. This means for every one correct and functional sequence, there are 10 to the 77th incorrect sequences. To put this in perspective, there are only 10 to the 65th atoms in the Milky Way galaxy. And there's an even bigger problem with random mutation. Live science says that we can roughly estimate that there have been approximately, this is a big number, 4.5 times 10 to the 27th animals that have ever lived on Earth. Now this is a rough estimate, but 10 to the 77th power is significantly larger than 4.5 times 10 to the 27th power. 10 to the 77th is bigger than 10 to the 27th. And remember, there are 10 to the 77th incorrect sequences for every one functional protein, and there are around 10 to the 27th animals that have ever lived on Earth. This means that a random mutational search would very likely fail to produce even one new functional protein in all of the history of life on Earth. There have not been enough living creatures on the face of this planet for a random mutation to have the chance to produce a functional brand new organism. But look around you. There are billions of thriving creatures on planet Earth. This means that random mutation got the sequence right nearly every single time, despite the odds. So, where does this leave us? Again, a random search is much more likely to fail than to succeed. But the main point I want to leave you with today is this. As I've been saying repeatedly in this video, DNA is information. It is instructions for proteins. I want to drive the main point home with this quote by Stephen C. Meyer. We do not have a single example of anything in the history of the universe in which information does not come from intelligence. Information, such as information in a digital code, in a radio signal, or in a book, it invariably comes from a source of intelligence or from a mind. So keep in mind, we aren't just trying to explain away simple information, but rather some of the most complex and organized information that we know today, which is DNA. DNA is a complex, informative molecule. Similar to what Mr. Meyer put forward, consider this quote from Dr. Werner Gett. He says, "There is no known natural law through which matter can give rise to information. A code system is always the result of a mental process." And DNA is much like a code system. And I'm actually going to read a couple of quotes to you from scientists to drive this point home even further. Bill Gates says, "DNA is like a computer program." Leroy Hood, "DNA represents digital code." Richard Dawkins, "The machine code of the genes is uncannily computer-like." So, it is agreed upon by many scientists, DNA is just like a code system, and as Dr. Gitt puts it, a code system is always the result of a mental process. Because of the extremely small chance that random, unguided changes in DNA will give rise to even a single functional protein, I find it very hard to believe that brand new organisms can arise all on their own. It seems to me that the data points strongly to a source of divine intelligence. This divine mind created a code system, a master code book, if you will, which is seen in different variations in all species and organisms on planet Earth. We contain similar parts to other organisms, but are intentionally and individually designed. From this master code, we see all of life's diversity. It seems to me that new organisms arise because of intentional, careful changes in a DNA sequence. These changes have to be intentional because of how finicky DNA is. DNA is another reason why I strongly believe in a designer, a creator of the cosmos, and an intentional God. and it's okay if you disagree with me. I also want to point out that evolution, which again was not the topic of today's video, is a theory on the origin of life. But there is sort of a subtopic here, which is, where did all of life originate from? And according to evolutionary theory, all of life evolved and arose from a single-celled organism. But even a single-celled organism contains DNA because all cells contain DNA. So the question is, where did that first single-celled organism come from? And how did its DNA get here? Now, this is a topic and a question that does not have a consensus yet within the scientific community. Evolution does not necessarily take a stance on where that first set of DNA and biological information came from. But I think it's important to just recognize that since DNA is some of the most complex, organized, and important information for all of life, how did that first cell with such complex, organized information get there? Does it make more sense that it just happened to be there, considering how finicky, how particular, how ordered and complex a DNA molecule is? Or could it be possible that somebody, some source of intelligence, created it and designed it? That's up for you to decide. But thank you so much for tuning into this episode. If you found this interesting, I'm going to link a video by Daily Dose of Wisdom. It's going to take you to a link of an episode with a short clip of an interview with Dr. Stephen Meyer and Dr. my gosh, what's his name? Oh, James Tour. Dr. Meyer and Dr. James Tour. And if you guys want more information, I thought that interview was very informative, so highly recommend checking it out if you want to learn more about this topic. But thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Reasons We Believe. In the last 3 episodes, we laid out how scientific principles and empirical observations point back logically to a creator. I tried my best to sort of bridge the gap between faith and science that is so prominent in culture today. And I will continue to do this in future episodes because I think if I'm going to devote so much of my life to my belief in God, I better know why I believe that. But to give you a glimpse of what's coming in future episodes, I'm going to start laying out how I believe this God, this divine mind in the cosmos, has revealed himself to humankind in history, and what this means in terms of having a personal relationship with him. Maybe you still think I'm completely wrong and full of fallacies and fairy tales, but I do hope you'll stick around in the future. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.